Good afternoon. During Obama's presidential regime, he failed to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, and again made the case that we are not at war with Islam. I'm not only here to argue that Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terror, but to make the inconvenient point that not only are we at war with Islam, but that moderate Islam is at war with Islam. Pew polled a number of Islamic communities within countries in 2006 with the question of whether or not they thought suicide bombings were often, sometimes, rarely, or never justified. Of the Muslims who did not answer never, the total percentages in Britain was 24%, 35% in France, and 25% in Spain. It gets worse when you go east, 53% in Egypt, 26% in Turkey, 57% in Jordan, and 69% of Muslims in Nigeria think that suicide bombing is either often, sometimes, or rarely justified. Given the destructive nature of such an act, how could you expect a civilization with such horrible views on strapping bombs to your chest to even be? In reality, there are many factors, but one that is undeniable would be the destructive and aggressive incitements to violence and hostile attitudes towards non-believers within the Quran and the Hadith itself. From the Quran, and I quote, 298, God is the enemy of unbelievers. 190-93, slay them wherever you find them. Drive them out from the places for which they drove you. Idolatry is worse than carnage. If they attack you, put them to the sword. Thus shall the unbelievers be rewarded. If they desist, God is forgiving and merciful. Fight against them until idolatry is no more and God's religious reign supreme. 2:216. Fighting is obligatory for you, much as you dislike it. But you may hate a thing although it is good for you, and love a thing although it is bad for you. God knows, but you know not. 3:118. Believers, do not make friends with any but your own people. They will spare no pains to corrupt you. They desire nothing but your ruin. Their hatred is evident from what they utter with their mouths, but greater is the hatred which their breasts conceal. From the Hadith, and I quote, a day and night of fighting on the frontier is better than a month in fasting of prayer. Nobody who dies and finds good from Allah in the hereafter would wish to come back and see this world, even if you were giving the whole world and whatever is in it, except the martyr who, on seeing the superiority of martyrdom, would like to come back to the world and get killed again in Allah's cause. He who dies without having taken part in a campaign dies in a kind of unbelief. Now, we can argue all day long about what the strategy in addressing such a problem. My approach is to address everything in full honesty. The malevolent attitudes about spreading Islam and the faith through destructive means can be found in the original source material. And if you put a moderate Muslim and a Muslim member of ISIS in a debate hall, I can guarantee you that while the moderate Muslim will be primarily appealing to Western values to make his case, the member of ISIS will be endlessly repeating these verses and the dozens of others just like them from their foundational religious texts over and over and over and over again. Since both members of the debate agree that the Quran is the holy word of God, the moderate Muslim has a problem arguing that Islam is a religion of peace, or that member of ISIS is not a true Muslim, and the ISIS member is practicing radical Islamic terrorism. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that speech. I'm going to begin by providing a couple arguments on the role of the president and how Obama used this terminology. And then we're going to be looking at some evidence to dispute the affirmatives case. I want to begin by taking a look at understanding the complex, nuanced, and diplomatic role of the President of the United States. The reason that Obama did not use the term radical Islamic terrorism, it goes beyond some sort of conspiratorial belief that maybe he was a Muslim or maybe he loved Islam or something like that. There are very specific reasons. The first of which is diplomacy. According to Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, he argued that Obama was fighting a war in the Middle East that was dependent on the support of Muslim-majority countries such as Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And what he was doing in refusing to use the term radical Islamic terrorism was he was refusing to attack the religion of his regional allies. Because when you're involved in a multi-trillion-dollar war and you're dependent on these people for success, attacking a religion and comparing your allies to the enemy on religious grounds is not a good way to strategically be successful in a war. The second reason Obama avoided using the term was he wanted to avoid legitimizing the narrative of terrorist organizations. For instance, ISIS and Al-Qaeda frequently paint a West versus Islam picture in their propaganda. A really good example of this is Trump's Muslim ban, which ISIS called the Blessed Ban, according to Business Insider. And the reason they called it the Blessed Ban was because it gave them so much ammunition for their propaganda machine. Obama's strategy was to avoid language that legitimizes a dichotomy of West versus Islam. He wanted to paint the picture as the West and Islam versus radical nut jobs. And he did that in order to avoid giving the terrorists weapons to recruit impressionable people with. So he wanted to be diplomatic and nuanced as president, and he also wanted to avoid legitimizing the narrative of ISIS which is why he refused to use the term radical Islamic terrorist. Now, with those justifications for the president's behavior finished, I want to go ahead and look at the affirmative case. We'll start with the Pew poll research that he cited. I have two responses to this. The general gist of the evidence seems to be there are a lot of Muslims that believe that violence is okay. According to the latest statistics I could find, there are about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, which means that clearly the vast majority of these people disagree with violence, or we would see violence on a greater scale. But secondly, I have some statistics from Reason magazine here. Your risk from being killed in a jihadist terrorist attack in the last 15 years was approximately 1 in 2.7 million, compared to your lifetime risk of dying in a lightning strike being 1 in 161,000, and your chance of being killed in a motor vehicle crash is 1 to 114. Clearly, the majority of Muslims do not believe in this sort of thing, and irrespective of what the Quran says about violence, the majority of Muslims don't even believe the Quran or the Hadith in its entirety, and therefore I believe the president was justified.
Okay, so you mentioned a number of things there. The first thing is that you were talking about how it was diplomacy-wise, it was effective for Obama to not say that we were at war with Islam. Well, unfortunately, making some sort of strategy in order to sort of like benefit what you intend to do in the world will not make as much of a lasting effort if you actually address the source material. So if you organize this sort of band-aid solution in which you are going to appease countries, in which Pew has polled, many of these Muslim majority countries, and their attitudes towards women and everything are completely terrible. And I've looked up those sources. It's in Pew polls. It's the global standard of research. I looked it up this morning. If you're going to appease those countries, the horrible attitudes towards Islam and towards everything is going to continue, because essentially what you're creating is this unity between the horrible, like super right-wing fundamentalist edge of Islam and the progressive values of America. And so when you do that, the problem is that you aren't actually addressing the root problem. And if you were actually say these attitudes and these problems within the Hadith and the Quran itself is where these attitudes are coming from, and if we can convince people that this is not a good way to treat people, and that it comes from systemic Islamic, until you address that, this rollout of the horrible treatment of women, the insistence that women wear veils and hijabs against their will, the idea that they're not allowed to divorce their husband, all of these terrible things that come from Islam, including radical Islamic terrorism, which is the majority of terrorist attacks. The reason that we can find that is because of the source material itself, as well as many other factors. But hitting that sort of main factor would have a much better effect on the Islamic community backpedaling into a moderate position, the way that we have in the United States, in the same way that the Christian community backpedaled into a much more moderate position after the attack of atheism in the era of 2007 to 2012. Generally, that was achieved through argument and reasoning. And if Obama would be a lot more frank about the problem, he would have achieved some similar goals, and we probably would look in a much different world, rather than attempting to appease sort of radical endorsing communities of Islamic terror as opposed to that. The endorsement of violence is the reason why Islam makes up the majority of terrorist attacks. Until you actually address those fundamental ideals and attempt to start changing people's minds, you are only just downstream from the actual root source of the problem. Thank you.
Okay, so I think you ran three different arguments in that last speech. I'm going to talk about them individually. First, you began by making this claim that strategy has less of an impact than identifying the issue. I want to restate this argument so the judges can see just how problematic this is. Your argument is literally the international political strategy of one of the most popular presidents in United States history, and his strategy to deal with radical terrorism in the Middle East is less effective than him saying the words radical Islamic terrorism, and that those words, radical Islamic terrorism, would have somehow magically enabled him to immediately win the war on terror. That's your argument. You're taking the opinion of all of his foreign policy advisors, as well as the entire military, and saying that that is less valuable or that is less effective than the words radical Islamic terrorism. I hope you can see that doesn't make any sense. I would also challenge you to find me examples of world leaders that were able to win a war based on the name that they call their enemies. That's not how you win wars. You win wars through force and through diplomacy. And as we'll see in just a minute, Obama was actually using both of those. Let's look at your second argument, which is appeasing countries that, that practice Islamic beliefs does not fix the underlying problem. I just want to be clear. You can't just go at war with everyone that you disagree with. So, for example, up until recently, Saudi Arabia didn't allow women to drive cars. In America, by and large, we disagree with that. We think that's a problem. But Saudi Arabia sells us a lot of oil, and Saudi Arabia is also an important strategic partner in the war on terror. So as a result, it makes more sense for us to be diplomatic partners with Saudi Arabia than it makes sense to go to war with them or to oppose them because we disagree with something that they believe. But secondly, this diplomatic approach that Obama was using actually enabled us to defeat the terrorists. Obama was actually very successful in his campaigns in the Middle East, was able to destroy the remnants of al-Qaeda and keep ISIS suppressed for a while as well. So this kind of diplomatic approach actually enabled him to be effective in the war on terror. Now, your third argument was referencing all the stuff from the Quran you cited. These terrible things come from Islam, and that we shouldn't approve of them. We shouldn't approve of the way that they treat women, their belief in violence, and so on and so forth. I just want to clarify two things here. First of all, the majority of Muslims are peaceful. Like I read just a minute ago, the odds of you being killed in a jihadist terror attack over the last 15 years are 1 in 2.6 million. Your odds of dying in a car attack are several 100,000 times more likely than you being killed by a terrorist. There are many, many Muslims in the world, but the vast majority of them are peaceful. And I'd also like to point out that what Obama was actually trying to do was to handle these kind of violent beliefs in a peaceful, non-inflammatory way, which is the diplomatic role that a president is supposed to be fulfilling.
Okay, so you misrepresented my argument with your first point. I'm suggesting that we sort of take on the root cause of what's causing ISIS and destruct their ideals. That would take wind out of their sails and essentially sort of like cause, put their question into cause, whereas you have a large, sect, according to my statistics, a large sect of the community that's sympathizing to the things that they do. If you put out there, it's not okay to sort of, treat people like this or to think this. And the problem is, within what's happening in your congregations and what you are focusing on as a congregation, as a religious community, focusing on, the spreading of the religious message and everything. If you attack that source material, you're going to end up with a much more different world. And I think that your idea of being sort of diplomatic with countries that don't allow women to drive in Saudi Arabia, for example, I think that's an implicit endorsement and actually sort of halts progress when it comes to that. Because ISIS is going to be crazy for a really long time, but the much more important thing is sort of changing the Islamic world en masse and causing them to turn against their most radical fringes. And for the moderate Muslim to be equipped with those arguments properly, you're going to have to address what's actually in the Quran rather than play this emotion. Well, you're our friends and they're our enemies. We don't exactly have a proper logical structure as to why, but we're just going to implement that anyways. No, if we address this entire problem honestly and go to the source material, that'll cause people within the faith of Islam to have a much more collective, reasonable, and thoughtful change within the way that they think about these things. And the source material is the cause when it comes to the most radicalized fringe within Islam. You said that your chances are like less to get, struck with lightning, all that. I don't acknowledge that, but when it comes to things like mass shootings, you're being shot by the police, all these issues that all these political organizations are thinking of. The idea that the occurrence is rare just because there's billions of people on Earth doesn't really make the issue a non-impactful issue. It's still an impactful issue with people. And because of the source material of Islam, you have the most radicalized religious fringe out of any religion on Earth. And we should be fighting against that by being honest about the problem rather than attempting to be strategic, because bending and holding back the truth in the service of strategy in and of itself is dishonest. Everyone will implicitly feel that with at least their intuition, if not their conscious reasoning. Thank you.
So I hear two arguments in your last speech. The first is that we need to take on the root cause of terrorism and the root cause of violence. And the second is that by being diplomatic, by quote unquote bending the truth, as you call it, we basically create an implicit endorsement of Islam. So let's start with this argument of the root cause. My question would be, how are we going to take on the root cause? Your proposal is we're going to call a radical terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism. There are a couple problems here. First of all, you're assuming that it's going to magically fix the problem of terrorism, or that it's somehow going to embolden us to successfully defeat terrorism. That is, from a political science, international relations standpoint, academically speaking, that is illiterate. Changing how you describe terrorists by one word does not enable you to win a war. That is a ridiculous, unfounded assertion. Your second argument here is that this is how an essence plays out. If we call Muslims radicals, we're going to make Muslims like us, and we're also going to make them less violent. That's not how that works. Like I said in my first speech, ISIS called Trump's travel ban the golden ban because it gave them so much ammunition for their propaganda machine, because they were able to say, aha, the West hates us. They're banning us from their countries. They're at war with us. And they were also able to point to Trump's rhetoric, talking about terrorists as being Islamic and so on and so forth. They were able to point to that rhetoric and again say, aha, the West hates us. This is a war of us versus them. So your argument boils down to, if we call terrorists Muslims, Muslims in general will hate us less. That doesn't make any sense at a fundamental level. If you insult an entire religion and label an entire religion a terrorist organization, then what happens is you're going to anger people in that religion, and if anything, give the real terrorists more ammunition for their propaganda machine. Now, the second argument of diplomacy being an implicit endorsement, and again, we have to be able to address the root cause. I have a couple questions for you here. First of all, what is the alternative to diplomacy? They're just going to attack everyone that we disagree with? Like, look, I don't like what Saudi Arabia does and how they treat women and that kind of thing, but I also like being able to buy oil from them. And so it makes sense to have diplomatic relations with countries that, well, you may not agree with everything that they do. Russia is a good example of this. We need to have good diplomatic ties with Russia, even though we disagree with how they handle themselves as a country. So the first question is, what is the alternative? Are you really just going to go to war with everyone you disagree with? But the second question is this: the government cannot change how people think. Changing the word from radical terrorism to radical Islamic terrorism does not change how people think. But rather, what Obama was attempting to do is he was attempting to spread a peaceful diplomatic message, and instead of stigmatizing an entire religion as the enemy, he was trying to turn the tables and instead focus on the individuals who are perpetuating those crimes instead of a religion full of peaceful people.
Okay, so if terrorists have no allies, they're only defunded on a monetary issue. They're debased on a philosophical and social stance. If you wage a war of ideas with these countries that sort of have these stances and are sympathetic to ISIS, and you win that war, and wars of ideology have been won all the time. It's not this idea of like, well, they're never going to change their minds. No, I mean, mental evolution is literally the entire reason we're here. So if you have a war of ideas and you're waging it against pretty much everyone that you disagree with, you're not only going to affect change in the reasonable people willing to listen to you, but that's also a sort of domino effect that's going to affect everyone who is sort of sticking their heels in the mud. And what you would get from a result of that, and being honest, would be a defunding of ISIS and a social rejection of them, not just in the West, but in the East as well. And now, you made the idea, you made the case that Islam, that we're at war with, that making the stance that we're at war with Muslims is a bad idea or a bad thing to say. And what I've been repeating like over and over again is that we're not against people, okay? People are not ideology. We are at war with Islam. We are not at war with Muslims. Obama can make all these sorts of concessions and get as nuanced as he wants. And because he has the platform of the President of the United States of America, everyone would listen to him. It doesn't just have to be a soundbite. So there are fundamental problems within the center of the ideology that's being rolled out when it comes to religious communities within Islam. And addressing that is going to be very effective, because people are convinced by good arguments before they're convinced by propaganda. And your idea that people are just going to get sucked in by this propaganda machine, it's bullcrap, because if you have good ideas, that just mows over a propaganda machine, and everyone can intuitively feel that, even the people who want to be convinced by the propaganda. It's called a pit in your stomach, and it's not emotional, it's rational. Your brain is discovering, oh, their arguments beat ours, and that's the problem. So you also made another argument that you really like getting oil from Saudi Arabia, and that makes it okay that they're suffering. So I just want to know why you think it's okay that women are suffering in Saudi Arabia, and it's okay that they suffer in Arabia just so you can drive your car. I really want to know why you think that that's a morally found, good stance to hold. And I'm not suggesting that we go to war with everyone that we disagree, that we wage a war of ideas, not a literal war, a discussion, and take this discussion globally. And I want Muslims to be able to say there's a problem with fundamentalist Islam. And they're going to be more equipped to do that if we're honest about it. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to kind of turn this back to the resolution, because what we're supposed to talking about is whether or not Obama should have used the phrase radical Islamic terrorism. So in terms of that, let's start by let's do a quick net beneficial comparison between using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism or using the phrase that Obama preferred, which was radical terrorism. The first response here is that this is an insignificant change. My question to you would be this: does inserting one word in or out of the phrase radical Islamic terrorism enable Obama to win a war? The answer is no. Arguing that a single word allows him to win the war on terror is, from an academic standpoint, is illiterate. Political scientists who study this kind of thing do not, by and large, hold that changing one word allows you to win a war. That's not how international relations works. The second response is that, on the other hand, that diplomacy does matter. That by refusing to label terrorists and put them in the same group as a, by and large, peaceful religion, that does actually do something. And on a net beneficial standard, I win here. So if we look at the two options here, one, we use the word radical Islamic terrorism. What do? We give propaganda to terrorists. We insult peaceful Americans. And we don't actually win the war. We don't change anything. On the other hand, if we refuse to use that word, what we do is we don't give terrorists propaganda. We don't insult and demean fellow Americans. And what we end up doing there is we pursue a diplomatic, peaceful process. We don't politicize a term. And that, in my mind, is the better way to go about this. Obama made the smart call here, and that diplomacy is more important than whatever the heck it is you're advocating for. Now, talking about how diplomacy works, you go back to this idea that diplomatic relationships is an implicit endorsement. And you said that I'm okay with how women are treated in Saudi Arabia because I want to buy oil. I just want to clarify, that's called an ad hominem fallacy, where you attack me personally instead of attacking my argument. My argument was that diplomacy is a good and valuable tool. Economically speaking, the only way that we can improve the situation of those people in Saudi Arabia is by purchasing products from them. And when we purchase products from them, we raise their standard of living and allow them to come to a place where pluralistic democratic society is actually possible. If instead we boycott them and don't purchase products from them, their standard of living goes down, and it's likely they'll become more oppressed. That's economics. My position is this, is that we need to have diplomatic relations with people, even if we disagree with them, because as Obama did during his term as president, he wanted to pursue this concept of diplomacy. And you continue to talk about how the Quran advocates for these kinds of things. I'm not disputing what the Quran says. I'm disputing what the majority of Muslims believe. What you're talking about in the Quran is what 99% of Muslims across the world reject. That's why there are a few 100,000 terrorists in the Middle East and nowhere else. That's why your chance of dying in a terrorist attack are slim to none, because literally no one believes this, in Obama's words.
Okay, so radical Islamic terrorism is a more truthful account of what's actually going on. In order to use if you want to use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, I think that's a better strategy to use, because people in understanding truth will act in accordance with reality more accurately. Because when people aren't aware that it's actually like Islamic terrorism, then they will not act in accordance with reality based on lacking that specific information, and that can manifest itself in a number of ways. And there's no negative benefit when it comes to, oh well, I mean, the Muslims are gonna the American Muslims, like, they're going to feel insulted. They're not going to feel insulted because they're more different than fundamentalist Islamists than, say, moderate Muslims are akin to Christian moderates. And this leads me to my next point, acknowledging that Christian terrorism of bombing abortion clinics doesn't incur wrath against the Christian community. People aren't stupid. They can understand that there's a difference. It won't create a misunderstanding of like, oh, well, then all of Islam is bad. No, saying radical Islamic terrorism is not akin to saying just Islam. And people implicitly understand that. So, when it came to your claim that I accused you of an ad hominem, I think that's false, because diplomacy has a line in the sand, and I think that you crossed it by just saying, well, it's okay that people suffer in Saudi Arabia because it's important for us to get that oil. I think it's more important to take a stand and take that economic suffering as opposed to, well, we endorse Saudi Arabia, because this is used on anyone who actually, engages in diplomacy with Saudi Arabia, including Trump, who went to Saudi Arabia and got penalized for it by the American left. Now, you can be diplomatic and actually criticize ideas at the same time. You're trying to force it into this dichotomy. It's actually, you can actually do both. You can be diplomatic with the country and say, hey, I really appreciate you guys, we should trade and stuff. But by the way, I find a lot of what you do when it comes to the organization of your communities and your foundational principles to be highly immoral or outdated or what have you. And the idea that you said that the Islamic community, 99% of it is like, extremely peaceful. I haven't seen any actual figures on that. That's just kind of a statement, but it kind of goes at odds with the figures that I presented, which is these frightening amount of percentages in both European and Middle Eastern Islamic communities of bafflingly large minorities that support Islamic bombing, like strapping bombs to your chest. So that definitely suggests that there is a problem, which is something that I think we should be willing to admit.
All right, so in my last speech, I just want to talk about what I think are kind of the three most important elements of the round. I want to talk about strategy, I want to talk about diplomacy, and I want to talk about the status of Islam. So let's begin with strategy. I want to do kind of a two worlds comparison between my opponent's case and my case, which is what the Obama administration did. So according to my opponent, in order to defeat radical terrorism, in order to defeat the defunct evil ideology of Islam, in order to win the war on terror, we need to do one simple thing, and that is to insert the word radical and insert the word Islamic between the words radical and terrorism, and bada boom, bada bing, we win the war. In my analysis, this does two things. First of all, it angers peaceable Muslims unnecessarily. Secondly, just like Obama said, it gives ammunition to the terrorist propaganda machine. And third, it doesn't actually accomplish anything. Changing a single word does not allow you to win a war. My alternative is this. You don't insert the word Islamic, because categorizing a religion and associating them with a terror organization is problematic because it insults people and it gives weapons to terrorists. So let's look at this on balance. What happens if you go with my opponent's plan? First of all, you don't win the war because changing a single word doesn't win you any wars. And secondly, you anger people who want nothing to do with terrorism, which I think is a bad thing. If you go with what I'm advocating, which is what Obama did when he was in office, what you do is you pursue a peaceful diplomatic stance that enables you to maintain strategic allies to being successful in your campaign in the Middle East, and it prevents you from giving ammunition to terrorist advertising, and it prevents you from unnecessarily angering people. And I think on balance, my strategy is preferable. Secondly, let's talk about diplomacy. Again, my opponent continues to attack me by saying that it's unethical to trade with countries who do bad things. I just want to clarify, from an economic standpoint, the only way to make a country better for the people who live there is to trade with them. A really good case study of this is North Korea versus South Korea. 50, 60, 70 years ago, North Korea and South Korea were in the same place economically, but because South Korea traded with its neighbors and they did things like make sweatshops, what happened in South Korea is that when people started working for $1 a day or $2 a day, 5 years later, they were working for $10 a day. And 10 years later, they were working for $100 a day. And what happens is when you trade with countries who do bad things, who do things like oppress women, you give them more wealth. And what that does is it enables social reform, is that it enables things like women's rights, and it enables oppression to end. Again, as basic economics 101. The last thing I want to talk about is the undeniable statistical reality that the majority of Muslims are peaceful. There are 1.8 billion of these people in the world. It is more likely that you will win the lottery, you will get the jackpot, than you will be involved in a terrorist plot plotted by a Muslim. Like the statistics I read in my first speech, you are infinitely more likely to die in a car accident or get hit by lightning than you are to die in a terrorist attack planned by a Muslim. And so I think what Obama did is right. He pursued the peaceful diplomatic path.
I would be more offended by not being truthful about the radical fringe of my religion. Wars of ideas are the fastest pathway to social change. Thank you very much.